Hello and welcome to the launch webinar of the Brown to Green report. My name is Melanie Stein. I'm a journalist and I'm very happy to guide you through. People from more than 40 countries have registered, so welcome to all of you. You're now going to listen to a summary of the report that was published yesterday. And 14 research organizations have been working on it. And so you are going to listen to experts who give you an independent overview on the G20 countries' actions, climate actions, what they do and what they should do. So you first listen to the experts and then we will have time for your questions. So if you have questions, you can hand them in already during the presentation. And first of all, I would now like to welcome Professor Dr. Peter Eigen. He is the founder of Transparency International and the co-chair of Climate Transparency. Hello, Peter. So why is transparency so important?
Well, we believe that transparency is incredibly important. It is important in order to give citizens the information which is necessary to hold powerful governments, powerful corporations accountable. It is very important for them to protect themselves against abuse. It is a shield against corruption. In many ways, it is a way to create trust, and trust is, of course, exactly what we need today in order to support better governance, to support effective and good politics.
And Peter, how do you actually make climate actions transparent?
Well, for the Brown to Green report, we rely on 14 organizations all over the world. I mean, from South Africa to Argentina to Mexico to China and so on, in order to create a global perspective, to become even more credible and convincing. We also look at national information, which is very important in order to compare countries with each other, to tell countries where they are doing well, but also to tell countries where they have to improve and how they can do it to improve their performance in the area of climate policy.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I am now talking to Lina Dunat. She's one of the main authors of the Brown to Green report. And so, Lina, what's new about this year's report?
Well, the Brown to Green report is the most detailed account of climate action in G20 countries, and this year's report is more comprehensive than ever. We now have 80 indicators in 3 areas, which is mitigation, so where do emissions go in the different sectors, how does the energy mix look like? Secondly, vulnerability, where do we already see climate impacts in the different G20 countries, and what climate impacts can we expect in a 3-degree world or a 1.5-degree world? And thirdly, financial flows. To what extent are G20 countries already shifting finance from brown to green? A very helpful new feature is also that we have benchmarks for a 1.5-degree world for the different sectors. So these point the direction into which the G20 countries would actually need to move. For example, by when would coal need to be phased out? By when would the last fossil fuel cars need to be sold if we really want to stick to 1.5 degree? And just a very quick note on the data we use. For most indicators, we have recent data of 2018. And our most important data sources are Enadata, International Energy Agency, World Bank, OECD, or the Climate Action Tracker. So these are international data sets. That means these data sets provide data for all G20 countries. But with our partner organizations that were mentioned before, in the different countries, we also checked national data from national ministries and tried to see where they diverged from the international data and tried to reconcile them with the international data.
Selina, what are the main findings?
So I think there are 3 main takeaways from this year's reports. First of all, G20 countries have very strong reasons for acting, for accelerating climate action. So if they don't move faster, we will get to a world that is 3 degrees hotter than now. And this would mean, for example, that 30% of the land area in G20 countries will not have enough water. Around 70% of such climate impacts can be avoided if we move to a 1.5 degree world instead of 3 degrees. Second key takeaway, around half of the G20 countries are currently walking into the wrong direction with increasing emissions, and none of them is doing enough for 1.5 degree. And thirdly, it is clear now where countries actually need to move, where they need to go and what they need to do. Most of the technological options and the policy options are on the table, and most of these options even make economic sense. Let me show just the most recent developments in CO2 emissions and energy supply. On average, the slide before, CO2 emissions increased by 1.8% in 2018. You see here on this slide the chain from 1990. The orange line indicates the CO2 emissions. And you can see that they stagnated a bit in 2014, 2015, before they started to pick up again in 2017, and now again in 2018. What are the main factors behind this trend? First, the economic output, the GDP is growing rapidly. You see this here in the dark gray line at the very top. This leads to energy consumption, to increasing energy consumption, because you need to fuel to produce the GDP. So there's this line in yellow. And the big problem now is that the energy we use in G20 countries is not getting much cleaner. This is the light gray line in the middle, which is carbon intensity. It shows how much emissions are produced for each unit of energy. And this one stays pretty much the same all over since 1990. And why is this so? Well, the G20 countries are producing more and more energy from renewables. The level of renewable energy has, on average, increased by 5% in 2018. But G20 countries are also producing more and more energy from coal, oil, and gas. So on average, the share of fossils in the energy mix remains pretty stable, at around 82%. This is 4/5 of the energy mix. Here you see the energy mix in the different G20 countries. It covers not only electricity, but also energy used for transport, for heating your buildings, for fueling industry. And you see here that with a few exceptions, fossil fuels are still the dominant energy source in almost all G20 countries. Just to pick a few examples, in Saudi Arabia on the very left, it's 100% fossil fuels. In China, 88%. And even in Germany, which was once the pioneer of renewables, fossil fuels still account for 79% of the energy mix. The little arrows at the bottom show where fossil fuel supply increased or decreased. And we see the biggest increases in 2018 in Indonesia and India, where coal and oil increased a lot, but also in Canada and US, where gas use increased. And this picture shows plenty of room for improvement, for a shift from fossil fuels to renewables, especially now that renewables are getting more competitive in all countries.
Well, the report comes out in a decisive moment because next year the countries are invited to present their updated climate target, the NDCs. And for the Brown to Green report, Claire Stockwell and her team from Climate Analytics compared the NDCs of the G20 countries. So Claire, what can you tell us about the NDCs?
Thank you, Melanie. The G20 at the moment is not on track for a 1.5 degree world. If we look at, as Lena alluded to earlier, the current targets that are on the table put us on a track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. If we look here in this figure in terms of what the G20 would need to do in terms of its fair share, it would have to cut emissions by at least half by 2030 from where its targets currently put it. If we turn instead to where the G20 is in terms of real-world action, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have about half of the G20 that is on track to meet its targets. However, the important thing to stress is that some of these targets are quite weak. And here, as you can see at the very sort of bottom of the graph, the weakest targets are in Turkey, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. The other half of the G20 is not on track to meet the targets that they have currently put on the table, and here the ones furthest off track are South Korea, Canada, and Australia.
And what can we expect for the NDC updates?
Well, I think what we need the G20 to do is clearly increase the level of strengthen their targets and scale up their climate action. The summit that took place this past September in New York, the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, was a disappointment and a missed opportunity. Few G20 countries spoke with any specificity in terms of the cuts in emissions that they would take on, and this is compared to the incoming president, COP president, has said that about 59 countries, other countries, anticipate scaling up their targets next year. And for a group that represents 80% of global emissions, we really need the G20 to strengthen their level of ambition.
So we heard that South Africa's current policies are not sufficient to meet its current NDCs. And now I'm hearing from Bruce McCall from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So Bruce, is South Africa revising its NDC for 2020? And what needs to be done to implement a more ambitious NDC?
Yes, South Africa may not meet its current NDC targets without more ambitious climate action. At the same time, President Ramaphosa has indicated that we will be increasing the ambition of our NDC and also committed to finalizing our comprehensive climate change bill, revising our national development plan, and finalizing a just transition plan to achieve this with the support of the international community. Critical areas to focus on will be reducing emissions from coal power stations, avoiding investing in new coal power stations, and accelerating investment in renewables, and retiring old power stations.
We are now jumping to another country, and we hear from Fabi Tumiva from the Institute of Essential Service Reform. He is also a partner of Climate Transparency. So what can be done to make Indonesia's NDC be more ambitious?
To make Indonesia NDC more ambitious is to have a shifting from fossil fuel in power and transport sector. In power sector, the measure should be reducing new coal power plant and triple renewable energy share by 2030. We need to strengthen energy efficiency measure by increasing minimum energy performance standards that will reduce electricity peak demand in the near future. Meanwhile, in transport, rapid electrification of vehicles and increasing fuel economy standard could be effective measures. In forestry sector, the government needs to do permanent moratorium for new licenses in primary and secondary forests as well as in peatland and strengthen forest rehabilitation.
The Brown to Green report looks at the performance of different sectors. And now I have here Hannah Schindler from Humboldt Vadrina Governance Platform. So Hannah, what are the newest trends?
Yes, our report looks at different sectors, the power, transport, buildings, industry, agriculture and forestry sector. And overall, I'm afraid there's bad news. There's an increase in emissions in all sectors across G20 countries. There's some sectors, such as power sector, where we see some countries moving ahead, where there's actually a transformative change happening. For example, the countries where a coal phase out is planned. But it's striking that in the transport sector, we don't see a transformative shift across the G20 countries yet. That's why I would like to talk a bit about the transport sector. Transport accounts for 20% of the energy-related CO2 emissions in the G20 countries. The emissions increased by 1.2% again in 2018. Why is this the case? Lena already talked about the economy that is still growing. So people are buying more cars, larger cars, heavier cars. And this is not only a trend in the United States, but increasingly also in Asia and the European Union. In fact, in 2018, 36% of the new cars sold were SUVs. In addition, we have increased global trade that leads to increased emissions from the freight transport. Here in the graph, you see the transport emissions per capita of the G20 countries. The big industrialized countries, the US, Canada, Australia, have the highest level of per capita emissions in the transport sector. And in fact, a person in the US emits 24 times more emissions than a person in India. However, the countries here on the far right side with the lowest levels, India, Indonesia, China, have the biggest trends over the last years. So emissions are growing there as well, which is, of course, from a climate perspective, a worrying sign as well.
Australia is the country with the highest aviation emissions, and it's also among the 3 top emitters when it comes to the transport sector. So now we hear from Ryan Wilson from Climate Analytics Office in Australia. So Ryan, does Australia have any policies to counterbalance this trend, or what needs to be done?
Hey guys, no, unfortunately there is a complete lack of policy from the current government for reducing transport sector emissions. What we need to see is a commitment to ban the sale of fossil fuel vehicles by 2035 at the latest, and support for encouraging the uptake of electric vehicles, including subsidies and building electric charging infrastructure. But Australia is lagging badly in other sectors too. For example, the electricity sector must be decarbonised by 2040, with a phase out of coal by 2030. Right now there's no intent from the government to expedite the closure of our ageing coal power plants, but that needs to change. Similarly, there are currently no effective policies in place to decarbonise the Australian industry sector. We need to see incentives for increasing energy efficiency, a return to carbon pricing, but also to develop new export and manufacturing opportunities like green hydrogen produced with renewable energy and zero-emission steel.
So Hannah, is Australia the only country lacking policies to reduce the emissions in the transport sector?
No, of course it's not. There's several other G20 countries that are lacking sufficient policies as well. We created a policy rating for each sector in the report. The rating has 4 categories. Low means basically there's no policy in place to reduce emissions in the sector. Medium is the category where there are some support policies to reduce emissions. High is if countries don't only have policies, but also a long-term vision how to reduce emissions in the sector. And if this long-term vision is also 1.5 compatible, so very ambitious, the country is a front runner in our report. So what needs to be done in the transport sector? First, we have to reduce emissions from cars. And we can see here in the rating that actually most G20 countries by now have some kind of support policies in place. So either energy efficiency or emission standards for cars, or support policies for electric vehicles. Nevertheless, these are still not sufficient. The country with the highest share of electric vehicles of new car sales in 2018 was China. China could double its electric vehicles last year. However, the market penetration is still just accounts for 4.5%, which is pretty low in general. Then we have 4 countries with a long-term vision to reduce emissions from cars. Canada, France, and the UK plan to phase out new fossil fuel cars by 2040. Japan does so by 2050. Canada is actually new in this section, so that's a new plan they just released this year. However, also here, the 4 countries are not doing enough for 1.5 degrees. That would mean they would have to phase out new fossil fuel cars by 2035 already. Then secondly, in the transport sector, we need to reduce emissions from freight transport. Here the picture looks a bit different. More and more countries are having energy efficiency and emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles, so trucks. The European Union, for example, is new on board this year, but there's no G20 country that has a long-term plan yet. Similar, we need a shift towards public transport, so trains, buses, etc., and a shift towards non-motorized transport, such as using more bikes. Here also a long-term vision is lacking in all G20 countries to reduce emissions in this field. China is arguably the country with the most progressive policies. It aims to substitute 30% of its motorized transport in urban centers by public transport by 2020, so actually next year. It also has the biggest electrified bus fleet worldwide, so more than 400,000 buses already. Overall, we can see here there's lots of opportunities for improvement, not only to reduce emissions in the transport sector, but also there's several health benefits to better air quality and also to reduce costs, reduce traffic jams and accidents.
We haven't been talking about Latin America. Mexico and Brazil have policies for reducing transport emissions. And now we hear from William Wiltz from the University COP in Rio de Janeiro. He is one of the authors of this year's Brown to Green report. So William, why did transport emissions decrease in Brazil, and what further policy is needed?
Yes, transport emissions reduced in the last 5 years, but because of a bad reason. We had a strong recession from the second half of 2014 to the end of 2016, and GDP fell almost 8%. Since then, we had a very slow recovery. Well, a 1.5 degree scenario would include, for sure, strong electrification of the fleet and also important investments in modal shift. Biofuels role would be limited in this scenario to the short and medium term. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's now talk to Mariana Gutierrez from ICM in Mexico City. So Mexico has announced that they go to net zero by 2050. So how will transportation look like in 2050?
Mexico is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters globally and requires deep decarbonization efforts to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In Mexico, the energy mix is dominated by fossil fuels, of which transport represents the largest end user. Therefore, achieving Mexico's climate commitments requires a transformational change in the energy sector, which is going against the Paris Agreement temperature limit. A transition in transport would improve air quality, reduce congestion, and the amount of accidents. In addition, phasing out fossil fuel light-duty vehicles by 2035 would be a concrete step to rapidly decarbonize the economy. For further information, please visit Mexico's country profile and the Brown to Green report at Climate Transparency Initiative's webpage. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the transport sector, G20 countries still provide high amounts of subsidies to fossil fuels. And Epik Genshu from Overseas Development Institute in London, you are one of the subsidies experts. What are the findings in the Brown to Green report this year?
So, Melanie, we know that through the Paris Agreement, countries have committed to aligning all their finance flows with a climate-compatible world. We also know that G20 countries themselves have committed to ending fossil fuel subsidies. They made this commitment back in 2009. Unfortunately, as you say, our research shows that G20 governments still provide $127 billion per year for fossil fuels production and consumption. Much of this goes to the transport sector, of course. You can see in this graph what they provide in terms of total amounts, but you can also see, importantly, what they provide in terms of the relative size of their economies. We, in terms of trends, see that actually the total amount of subsidies have decreased in the past few years, but we have to take this finding with caution because this is obviously related to fuel price decreases as well. And in the recent years, we unfortunately also see an increase in subsidies provided to oil and natural gas in particular in several countries, because many countries are now seeing gas as a bridge fuel, as a transition fuel, and investing heavily. Unfortunately, this is likely to lead to stranded assets and much more financial troubles for them in the future. And finally, in addition to all the subsidies provided through government budgets, G20 governments, as well as other governments around the world, also provide financing to fossil fuels through their different financial institutions. So through their national development banks, their export credit agencies, they continue to support fossil fuel production. For example, just to coal and coal-fired production alone, they provide about $17 billion of subsidies of financing per year domestically and about $10 billion of financing internationally per year.
So Argentina has the highest fossil fuel subsidies in the G20. And now we hear from Enrique Mautua Constantinidis from PAN in Buenos Aires. So why is this the case?
Thanks for being with us today. In terms of fossil fuel subsidies in Argentina, the main reason for the development and the big numbers in Argentina are the shale oil and gas reserves that are of much interest for most of the administrations and the political parties. This is poorly planned in a constantly devaluating economy. This means that subsidies will continue, and it's clear that at the moment we don't have certainty about what's the future for fossil fuel subsidies due to the next change in government this next December.
The finance section of the Brown to Green report contains for the first time a comparison of the G20 countries on how to green their financial system. And so, Ipek, what are the results of the comparison?
Well, actually, in terms of the overall trend, we do see some good news. There has been major shift in recent years where climate change is now being taken seriously as a risk for the entire financial system. So we've looked at central banks and other financial institutions, such as regulators, and the way they're monitoring and regulating the entire system, including commercial banks and businesses. Because they're well placed to develop policies and manage the systemic risks to the financial system. We've looked at different types of policies and which of the G20 countries are putting in place mandatory and voluntary policies, and which of the G20 countries are still have these policies under discussion. So, for example, when it comes to climate risk disclosure requirements, we see that mandatory policies are already in place in Brazil and France. There are voluntary policies in South Africa, and these are under discussion in Canada, Germany, Japan, and the UK. So when you look at the summary table, which is on the slide here, you will see that the dark green ones are the mandatory policies, several appearing here and there, and some voluntary ones, which are the light green ones. And then several under discussion as well, which are the yellow cells. Now, but what you also see is that most of the picture is still orange. It's still, countries are still not making enough progress. Now, finally, we also see some Asian countries, India, Indonesia, China, have also put in place some of those dark green mandatory policies, but we still have a long way to go for the rest of the G20 table to be complete.
So Asia is leading in greening its financial structure, architecture, particularly India. So now we hear from Mr. Rashmi, a distinguished fellow and program director at TERI in India. Could you explain the recent development in India, please?
India has undertaken very ambitious climate targets, but the climate responsive strategy also needs a huge amount of climate resources in terms of finance. And of late, there is a sufficient degree of awareness both in the government and the private sector that resources need to be deployed exclusively for the purpose of meeting environmental concerns. Fortunately, the green bonds has been a great success. India has issued almost 25 green bonds in the last 5-6 years, and it has mobilized as much as $30 billion of green bonds. And in fact, it is in terms of green bond issuance, it rates better than many other developed countries. But the future, the challenge for India in terms of climate finance and its climate strategy is that of nuancing its NDC in such a manner that it articulates its long-term goals. And it will have to bring in other sectors in addition to electricity and energy to be able to actually translate its environmental concerns and achieve the targets that it has set for itself.
So now we come to your questions. I will receive them via Skype. And the first question would be, which G20 country performs best across all indicators, Hannah?
Well, we always say we don't create an index on purpose, basically. All countries have some good and bad examples depending on the indicators we are looking at. Maybe you could in generally say it's Russia, Saudi Arabia, increasingly the US and Australia that are lacking behind across a number of indicators, but they also have good examples. Generally, it's also interesting to see that there's a rapid increase in policies across G20 countries just this year. For example, we have now the UK and France that have committed to net zero 2050 emission targets. They also have enshrined these into law. Germany is currently in the process to put these into law, this into law as well. Interestingly, also we have good improvements in the case of carbon pricing schemes. Almost all G20 countries now have a carbon pricing scheme in place. Since last year, Argentina is on board as well with a carbon tax, and South Africa since this year. Russia now ratified the Paris Agreement as well, and they are currently working on an emission trading scheme. In the power sector, for example, there's several countries leading with the coal phase out: France, the UK, Italy, Canada. In the transport sector, I was already talking about Canada, France, the UK, and Japan that are phasing out new fossil fuel-based cars. We also, as EPEC was alluding to, are looking at in the financial greening the financial system this year. There, astonishingly, it's the emerging economies that are leading in terms of climate-related disclosure policies or climate stress tests for banks. So, particularly India, China, Japan, and Indonesia.
Now I got a question from Haro. Thank you for that. The question is, do we have any indicators in this report which indicate that emissions could be reducing in 2019 or 2020? Who wants to answer this question?
I can give it a try.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in our report, we have indicators for all different sectors, for example, power, transport, buildings, industry, also the land use sector. And I think it's a bit difficult to give a prediction of where emissions are going to be reduced. I mean, we do see some positive trends in renewable energy, for example, in different countries. Some very ambitious targets have been proposed in India and Saudi Arabia. Now, the question is whether these governments actually follow up on the promises. If they do so, this would imply a good reduction in emissions, for example, in the power sector, which is still one of the most important sources of emissions. So I think it really depends on whether governments are going to follow up on their promises, and also whether they actually want to come up with new NDCs in 2020 and propose more ambitious NDCs that then will lead, hopefully, to more action on the ground, meaning action at home, whether they really implement policies for shifting transport to public transportation, for example, as I just said, implementing more renewables in the power sector or reducing emissions in the industry sector.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe to add to this briefly, I think as we saw, one of the main reasons is the growing economy, that there's an increase in energy demand, and the renewables are not fast enough to follow up with that. So I think also it's important to reduce demand as well. So that's, well, it's the consumer firstly, but also governments that are accountable to set incentives for reduced demand, because we will not catch up that fast if the economy keeps growing like that.
I have one question for Claire. The US has now officially withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. What does that mean?
It has indicated its intent to withdraw. It will only be able to withdraw under the terms of the Paris Agreement in 2020. The Climate Action Tracker recently did an analysis about where the US, the effect of the rollbacks that the Trump administration has put in place, and we calculated that emissions are projected to be 3% higher than they otherwise would have been in 2030 without these rollbacks. However, we have to, if we compare where our projections originally were anticipating the US emissions going in 2030 when he first took office, emissions are down. Our projections show that emissions will be 2% lower. So essentially, despite the president's efforts to try and protect the coal industry, that industry is still facing ongoing bankruptcies, and renewable energy is taking over.
All right, I have another question from Javier Camacho. Thank you for that. And he's asking, are any of the currently rising industry sectors a particular threat to climate change that should be addressed in advance? Who wants to answer this question?
Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah. Sure. Are any of the currently rising industry sectors a particular threat to climate change that should be addressed in advance?
I mean, I could just start off by saying it's usually not the rising ones, it's the incumbents that are a threat. So, we've been discussing the fossil fuel power sector. They've been in place for decades, and it's really this continued government support to them that means they are still a threat to us achieving our climate targets. What's encouraging is the new sectors, the clean energy technologies, the smarter consumption technologies, the emerging sectors are actually what we have to be hopeful for. But it's just the world realizing that we have to make this transition and we shouldn't be dragging our feet, and we just need to be ambitious about the future technologies, and we should be looking forward to them taking place. Structural transformations have happened across different sectors of the economy for all of time, and we just need to make sure that the transformation is now happening to clean technologies and make sure the outdated, dirty technologies are winding down. Of course, in making this transition, we have to make sure that we take into account the vulnerable populations that will be affected by it, and also the sectors, the workers in the sectors that will be affected by it. But no, I wouldn't say that the emerging industries are a threat. I would say that they're actually our solution.
Lena wants to add.
Yeah, thank you, Ipek. I completely agree that the incumbent sectors are mostly the biggest problem. Just to highlight that there are a few sectors that might, or like a few developments that might put a risk as well to our climate targets. Like we see aviation's emissions per capita increasing a lot because more and more people are flying, and it's like it becomes a more and more frequent means of traveling. There's just one example. Then fracking, for example, has also high climate impacts, which is of course a danger to our climate targets. And then we have like an example that Hannah mentioned earlier in the car industry. For example, we have more and more electric vehicles, but we also have bigger and bigger cars, like SUVs driving around, and not all of them are electric, and even if they're electric, they use a lot of energy for each kilometer they drive. So these are developments that do put a risk, I would say. So we always have to be careful which industry we actually push as governments, like where do we put the money, which new developments do we want to support and which ones not.
I have another question for Ipek from Peter Wing, and he asked, is divestment of fossil holdings in personal savings and pension funds an effective strategy at changing corporate and national behavior?
Well, so divestment is showing the significance of the movement, right? So like people on the streets are calling for this, shareholders are calling for this. So in terms of a political signal, of course, it's very important. It's showing that shareholders are no longer interested in these assets because they're actually worried about their financial performance. Unfortunately, divesting away often means that other investors step in, and this is what we have to be careful about. So, when certain sectors stop investing, when certain sectors no longer receive investments, it shouldn't mean that these investments are now coming from other places. So it is an important signal, and it is the start of the movement, but ultimately it has to be everybody investing in clean technologies.
Well, Claire, what actually needs to happen now in G20 countries to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees?
Well, as I mentioned at the top of my presentation, the G20 would need as a whole to do its fair share to cut its emissions by at least half by 2030 from where its targets currently take it. We heard from Bryce in the course of the presentations that the South African president has indicated that they are strengthening their NDCs. Hannah mentioned that Russia has ratified the Paris Agreement, so this would be a prime opportunity for Russia to come forward with a stronger target. If we look to Canada, for example, during the recent elections there, the Prime Minister indicated that he would adopt a net zero target by 2050. We would need that target to be in legislation, to be enshrined in legislation. And of course, while 2050 targets are very important, and we have had some discussion of that on the panel today, it's very important that it's the path as much as the pledge, that we need the really strong 2030 targets to make sure that we ultimately are in a position to hit net zero in 2050. So I think it really is stronger action across the board.
Well, Hannah, actually, which G20 country performs best over all the indicators?
I think we already alluded to this question. I would maybe rather speak to what Claire was already emphasizing, is what happens now. What we have COP in a few weeks ahead. Everyone knows there was a big change. It moved from Chile to Madrid. We are all now looking forward how Madrid and also the European Union can maybe contribute to the success of this year's COP. Yeah, I'm actually wondering, Spain is part of the EU delegation. The EU is actually doing pretty well in our report. It has a decrease of CO2 emissions in the last year. It has more ambitious renewable energy and energy efficiency targets, as well as new emission standards for light-duty vehicles since 2018 and 2019. It leads our policy rating in the building sector. All new buildings in the EU have to be net zero by 2020. And we heard from Claire also that the EU is on track to actually meet its NDC. There's probably two areas where the EU could improve, and this also in terms of now how it can improve the message it sends through the COP. The first one is that it pledges to have a more ambitious NDC, and the discussion there has already started within the European Union. The second one is that it commits to a net zero emission target by 2050. Also there, the EU already started to discuss that in June. It was 4 countries, now I think it's 3 countries still in the EU bloc that are still pushing against this target. But I think these are areas where the EU and also Spain could send a really strong signal.
I got a question from Cosima Starr, and she asked, what are your hopes in terms of how the report's findings are received by media, the public, and policymakers? Who wants to answer this question? Lina?
Yeah, thank you. We already had quite a good media response yesterday when we launched the report. There were many newspapers around the world reporting on this. So now the second step would, of course, be that civil society decision makers actually make use of the data that we have in the report to actually change action on the ground and not just have it in written. So I really hope that NGOs around the world will use the data to approach the policymakers in their country to show them where they could maybe learn from other G20 countries, where G20 countries maybe could build coalitions also now with the climate negotiations coming up and with the NDC updates for next year, to really see in which sectors they maybe could like cooperate to build new coalitions on industries, or to really establish common targets Yeah, and I think that that now France and China, for example, they have made a step forward to build a coalition and send a powerful signal to the international community that they stand behind the Paris Agreement. I think this is very important, also in face of the upcoming G20 and G7 presidencies next year, which are in the hand of Saudi Arabia and the US, which is going to be quite challenging. So all countries that actually put something up there and propose more ambitious targets and show more ambitious policies that they propose, I think will be like an important signal.
Brittany Warren from the G20 Research Group wants to know, is there information in the report on the global agriculture, forest, energy nexus? Can somebody say something about this?
Well, we for the first time this year, we have some indicators on agriculture and forests in our report. This is a very difficult area because data are very often not comparable between countries, and it's a very complex topic. I mean, there was a recent report launched by the IPCC, a special report on land use that came out a few months ago. I think that contains a lot of valuable information, but still, like country-specific comparable information, which is the information that we use in the Brown to Green report, is often lacking. So the indicators that we have in the report are more on gross forest loss and on the kind of the structure of emissions in the agricultural sector, but they don't really speak to that link yet because that's where we don't have the sufficient data at the moment. But maybe next year it's going to look better.
Okay, I have a question for Claire from Victor Rodriguez, and he wants to know what happens if the next round of NDCs is not enough to achieve 1.5 degrees, since there is no structured mechanism to allocate the emissions gap among countries.
Well, at first I would put it in perspective. We have next year, we expect countries to come up and submit strengthened NDCs as well as their long-term strategies. But we also, in addition to next year, we will go into there will be a global stock take in 2023 that will again be an opportunity to look at emissions and to strengthen then for the next round. So there is a continued ratchet up mechanism that is built into the Paris Agreement. I think what we see is with movements like Fridays for Future and the youth protests on the street, Extinction Rebellion, the people are waking up to the impacts of climate change, and there is the urgency to act is palpable. So I think now it is just the situation of continuing to put pressure on our leaders to translate that into strengthened targets and further action on the ground.
Ipek, what impact will Brexit have on the UK's climate lead at the moment?
Well, I mean, to start with the good news, the UK is generally doing quite well in terms of its climate leadership within the G20. It's decreased its emissions by 2% in 2018. It's made strong progress on decarbonising its power sector, phasing out its coal use, and it's put in strong targets. But at the same time, we know that just setting targets and being bold in words is not enough, and the action it's already performed has to be strengthened, because unfortunately, according to the UK's Committee on Climate Change, it's currently not on track to meet its emissions targets. So, yes, whether or not, going back to your question, which is the key question on many people's minds, whether or not the UK is part of the European Union, it will continue, in my opinion, to be a leader on climate change, and it will have to continue strengthening its policies and climate action as well. It's worked very well as part of Europe leading climate action in the world, but I think regardless of whether it's part of the official union or not, I think this role is still key. And also recently, data shows that this sector, the renewable sector, as well as energy efficiency sector, can create a lot of jobs and This is another area where, obviously, with the election coming up, political parties are very keen to make sure that climate action can be a win-win strategy. And I think, again, looking at it from a domestic economic point of view, stronger climate action and investing in the offshore wind industry and renewable industry is a strong asset for the UK. So regardless of what happens with the European Union relationship and what happens in the elections, I think UK can and should continue to be a climate leader.
Navriai Galai would like to know, are there particular trends from export credit agencies that we should be aware of?
So we know that some of them have made commitments to end financing for coal, which is welcome. But unfortunately, export credit agencies have so far been a form of sort of a government financing arm that's not been held held to account in terms of climate commitments. Often their arguments are that they're only supporting exports, and it's up to the countries that receive the financing to decide whether they want to invest in fossil fuels or renewable energies or high carbon or low carbon sectors. This argument is clearly flawed because countries have all committed, as I mentioned, to align all finance flows with a climate compatible world. So it's really their responsibility as well to make sure that they stop financing fossil fuels. So unfortunately, recent trends are not very encouraging because we don't see enough movement from export credit agencies, and it's really time that they step up their action.
I have a question for Hannah. And do you think that the cost for dealing with climate change falls disproportionately on the shoulders of poorer people who have a disproportionately contribution to emissions?
Yeah, I think that's a discussion that is growing. It used to be a discussion between developed and developing countries within the international negotiations, and it still is climate justice. But it's moving more and more to the national level because governments are seeing that they cannot push forward policies as long as they're not fair. And I would also agree that, of course, it's the rich people with their larger homes, bigger cars, etc., that contribute most emissions, and the poorer ones that are affected to also pay for it, depending on the climate policies in place. We have several countries now that are phasing out coal. Germany had a coal commission that actually was dealing with a just transition plan this year. Canada has also done a lot of interviews with people from coal regions, co-workers, to see how they can compensate these people, what are alternatives for the regions in terms of economic development. Now South Africa is starting this progress and is currently working with multi-stakeholder engagement on a just transition plan. And this topic also moves to other sectors as well. In Germany, we had this huge discussion this year around the climate change law. How can a fair carbon pricing scheme look like in the building and the transport sector? Obviously, if a person cannot afford to live in a city because the rent is too high, it lives outside in rural areas, but it needs to travel every day, maybe use a car to go inside the city for work. If you now have a high carbon tax in the transport sector, this person is disproportionately affected by it. So there are these discussions around it. In Germany now I heard there's several studies actually after now there's a draft of the climate change law that are stating that the poor people will be highly affected, even though that was a big discussion in government before. So we will see where that goes, but I think it's an essential topic all over.
Mm-hmm. Is there another, you want to add something?
Yeah, just to come in very quickly. I think it's always important to point out in this context that the current system, how it works now, is not necessarily fair. For example, currently, when you walk around Berlin, where we are at the moment, many people drive cars, but those that are most affected by it, they walk around and take the public transport, they do have the negative environmental consequences, the health effects and so on, but they don't the people that drive the car, that they don't pay for these negative side effects. So it's not a fair system in itself. So I think carbon taxes and many of the climate policies that we're now discussing are also a chance to address these inequalities and this unjust situation by establishing mechanisms, for example, in the carbon tax, to compensate poorer people or give them like a transport bonus so they can actually use public transport or shared transport systems and so on. So I think it's really like if we design it well and if we think through it properly, climate policies and carbon taxes can be a very good chance to make our world and our economies more just and fair.
Okay, Ipek wants to add something. 1 minute.
Because you mentioned the unfairness of the current system and also carbon taxes. So this is something that we also look at in the report, the revenues that can be generated through carbon pricing mechanisms. And also just to echo your points about the people who own the big cars, the big homes, are also the ones who get the highest amount of subsidies because they're the ones who are using most petrol and most electricity. So again, a successful reform of fossil fuel subsidies will entail subsidies being taken away from the richer population, but then making sure that the most vulnerable, who may be using a bigger portion of their everyday budget on getting to work through transport fees, can be compensated in this way. And there's many examples of successful subsidy reform which allow it to be done gradually and making sure that those that are most vulnerable and affected are compensated.
So thank you so much to all the experts here in the room and in the videos. Thank you for your participation. And if you like, you can download the report on the Climate Transparency website. And to sum up, we are going to listen to Álvaro Umana, the other co-chair of Climate Transparency.
Climate Transparency is a global partnership of 14 organizations from the majority of the G20 countries. This year's Brown to Green report is the 5th annual review of G20 climate action. The report comes out ahead of a crucial political moment to raise climate ambition. We know that higher ambition is needed, and the G20s have the potential to do it. Here are some of the key messages from the report. The G20 energy-related CO2 emissions increased in 2018 due to higher demand for electricity, heating, and transport. This increased demand is fed by energy from fossil fuels that increased by 2% in 2018. Today, 82% of the G20 energy mix still comes from fossil fuels. The NDCs of the G20 countries, as well as their current policies in the power, transport, building, industry, and land use sectors, are insufficient to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. Some countries, however, provide good practices. For example, Canada, France, Japan, and the UK are leading in banning the sale of fossil fuel-based cars. China nearly doubled the share of electric vehicles within 1 year and has the most ambitious policies to shift towards public transport. G20 countries need to cut their current greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45% in 2030 to be in line with the global benchmark set by the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. We know that extreme weather events lead to around 16,000 deaths and economic losses of $142 billion in G20 countries every year. Limiting global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees instead of 3 degrees would avoid over 70% of the impacts across such sectors as agriculture, water, and health. G20 countries still today provide about $127 billion in subsidies to coal, oil, and gas. In many countries, natural gas infrastructure and production have increased. About 70% of CO2 emissions in G20 countries are still unpriced or priced too low, but most countries have or are considering an explicit carbon pricing scheme. The Brown to Green Report 2019 also highlights key opportunities to enhance climate action across sectors. G20 countries should seize these opportunities and increase their ambition in 2020.